Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, I'm Michele Dunne, Middle East Program Director at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'd like to welcome you to our virtual launch event for the Project on Middle East Democracies report, President Trump's FY21 budget, examining U.S. assistance to the Middle East and North Africa in the shadow of COVID-19. I'll be moderating today's discussion. This is Pomed's 13th annual report unpacking the U.S. administration's budget request for assistance to countries in the Middle East North Africa region. And if you've ever read these reports before, you'll know they're a real education in how U.S. assistance works, how the United States works with these countries, and also how the executive and legislative branches interact, which has been particularly interesting in the last few years when there's been such a large difference between what the Trump administration requests and what the Congress appropriates in terms of foreign assistance. So here's how today's event is going to go. First, we're going to hear about the report's key findings from Andrew Miller of Pomed, who wrote the report along with his colleagues Seth Binder and Louisa Keeler. Then Senator Chris Murphy will give remarks and take a few questions from our audience members. We'll then move into the final portion of today's events, which will be a panel discussion with Nahal Toosi and Kori Schake, as well as some time for audience questions and answers. You will have the opportunity as participants to ask a question of Senator Murphy or our panelists. And the way you will do that is to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and submit your question. So now I'd like to turn it over to Pomed's Deputy Director for Policy, Andrew Miller, to present the key findings of the report. Andrew?
Thanks, Michele. First, I would like to begin by thanking my co-drafters, Seth Binder and Louisa Keeler, as well as Amy Hawthorne, Arwa Shobaki, Russell Solomon, and Merve Taharoglu for their contributions. And a special thanks to April Brady for her help with the new design as well as laying out this beautiful report. As Michele mentioned, this is Pomed's 13th annual report on the President's Foreign Affairs budget request. The purpose of this publication is to analyze what Congress appropriated this fiscal year, what the President is requesting for the upcoming fiscal year, and how Congress is likely to respond to the President's request. While we do consider the President's request for foreign aid at the global level and look at both security and non-security assistance, in keeping with Pomed's mission, this report focuses on the Middle East and North Africa with a special emphasis on democracy and governance assistance. To both summarize the report's findings and to put this report into context, I thought I would frame my remarks in terms of how the President's fiscal year 21 request is similar to his past requests, as well as how it's different from those requests. So starting, what has remained consistent? I think there are three key things. First, for the fourth consecutive year, President Trump has proposed a massive cut to foreign affairs spending, but Congress will almost certainly reject this proposal and appropriate higher levels of spending. The President's top line request of $44.1 billion for the foreign affairs budget is 2.9% higher than his FY20 request, but it would nevertheless still constitute a 22.2% cut as compared to what Congress appropriated last year in fiscal year 2020, which was about $56.6 billion. The House and the Senate have made very clear that they're not going to consider this report. As just one indication, Representative Elliot Engel, who's the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, called the request a, quote, waste of the paper it's printed on, and then predicted that Congress will again reject this proposal in resounding bipartisan fashion. The second constant is that the FY21 request continues the trend of securitizing U.S. assistance to the MENA region while marginalizing democracy and governance funding. Security assistance accounts for 83.4% of the total request for the MENA region, while democracy and governance funding represents a mere 2.9% of that global total. This is not a new phenomenon, but it's clear that during the Trump years, this securitization has become more acute and even more serious than it was under prior administrations. The third key constant is that Trump's request also continues the trend of protecting aid for Israel, Egypt, and Jordan, which are legacies of the Arab-Israeli conflict with high domestic political importance in the United States, while continuing to try to slash aid to Tunisia, which is the sole democracy to emerge from the Arab uprisings. The requests for Israel, Egypt, and Jordan are largely consistent with past years. Together, these three countries would account for 91% of the total request for the entire region. On the other hand, the administration's $83.8 million request for Tunisia would represent a cut of 65.3% from the fiscal year 20 appropriated level from Congress. So that's what's consistent. What's new in the president's FY21 budget request? Again, I've identified three items for symmetry. First, when compared to last year's request, the FY20 request, the Middle East and North Africa miss out on significant increases proposed for other regions. And this is comparing request to request, not request to what was actually appropriated. Trump's $6.5 billion request for MENA is about the same as he requested last year. However, East Asia, Europe, and the Western Hemisphere would get double-digit increases in percentage terms over what the president requested last year. This reverses a trend that had held during the Trump administration of protecting MENA aid while at the same time trying to cut assistance from other regions in the world. So that's an important development that is just emerging this year. Second, for the first time in decades, no bilateral funding is requested for the West Bank and Gaza. This reflects the administration's efforts to coerce the Palestinians into negotiating on Trump's plan. In place of bilateral funding, the administration is proposing a, quote, diplomatic progress fund, end quote, that would enable Trump to punish or reward the Palestinians with minimal congressional oversight. Last year in FY20, the administration requested $35 million in INCL funding for the Palestinian security forces, but this year, all of that money goes into this progress fund that is very much a slush fund as considered by staffers on the Hill. Third and finally, the biggest change in the president's FY21 request is the context, in particular, the emergence of the coronavirus pandemic. It's clear that COVID-19 will have an effect on US assistance in at least two ways. First, it will affect how the US administers aid. And by this, I mean that we've pulled Foreign Service officers, USAID employees from the field. They're not in the position to provide the aid to oversee it. So that's going to complicate how it is provided. Second, it will affect both the need for aid. More countries and more peoples will need additional assistance, and how much might be available. Unfortunately, we're working at cross purposes in that the global need for aid will be increasing at the same time that funding needs in the United States will increase, which could lead to less funding for the international landscape than would be ideal just at the time that we need more domestically. The budget request was prepared before there was an appreciation of how disruptive COVID-19 would be, so it doesn't account for the coronavirus impact. Nevertheless, congressional staffers are telling us that due to budgetary caps, which will expire after fiscal year 21, it will be difficult to appropriate as much funding in the regular budget as they would prefer. They will still try to earmark money, but they're going to have to rely on supplementals to a greater extent that can be difficult to negotiate with the Trump administration. In closing, it may be a bit too early to draw lessons, but I think the pandemic has underscored two clear things. One, the interdependence of countries and peoples. What's happening elsewhere is having an impact on the American people. I think this is very much an argument for additional US aid internationally because it's not just a handout to people abroad, it has a direct impact on the welfare of Americans. The second is the importance of investing in efficient, open, and accountable governance. When you look at the MENA region and how various countries have responded to COVID-19, it may not be a coincidence that the two countries that rated free, according to the Freedom House Freedom of the World rankings, are those who have handled the COVID-19 pandemic the best, and that would be Tunisia and Israel. Some authoritarian governments have handled it better than others, but the places in the Middle East and North Africa where we're seeing the most disruption, Iran, Egypt, are those that have the most authoritarian governments. Unfortunately, the Trump administration's aversion to foreign aid appears even more out of step with the enormous challenges the United States faces than it did before. And that is very much the context for the president's budget request. what the Congress will consider and the foreign assistance landscape moving forward, either under a second Trump administration or a new president. Thanks, Michelle. I'll stop there.
Does Michelle know that she's muted?
Michelle, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. I apologize to everyone. Okay. Thank you, Andrew. And we'll be back to you in a few minutes. And of course, we've been joined by now Senator Chris Murphy. And just a note for our audience, if you would like to ask Senator Murphy a question, please submit it by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We have limited time, so I apologize if we're not going to be able to get to all the questions. Senator Chris Murphy has represented Connecticut, my home state, in the United States Senate since 2013. And prior to that, he served in the House of Representatives from 2007 to 2013. He serves on the Senate Appropriations Committee's State, Foreign Ops, and Related Programs Subcommittee, and on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he's the ranking member on the subcommittee for Near East, South Asia, Central Asia, and counterterrorism. During his time in Congress, Senator Murphy has been a strong supporter of U.S. foreign assistance and of democracy and human rights abroad, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, which is why he received the Pomed Leader of Democracies Award in 2016. Senator, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you, Andrew, for that survey. And I appreciate the opportunity to join you here today and look forward to getting to as many questions as we can. So I'll make my opening remarks short. Listen, Andrew is very right to make the case as to why COVID has bound the world together in a new way. Through tragedy and crisis, we are reminded that we are all interconnected. And I just spoke about 5 minutes ago to Senator Graham. We are going to try to push for the next congressional appropriations bill surrounding the emergency response to COVID, which try to assure that it has an international title. It was interesting to me that the bill that came out of the House, the HEROES Act, did not have an international title. And while we are certainly grateful for the appropriation in the initial legislation to USAID and other agencies working on this response globally, it's not enough. But there are other ways in which the moment that we are experiencing in the United States is linked to countries around the world, and in particular in the Middle East. I made my first trip, taking me a long time to get there, to Lebanon last year. And I was there right at the moment that the Lebanese people, really in an apolitical way, were rising up to demand better governance. And it was the Lebanese military that was providing protection for those protesters, allowing them the space to demand real change from their government. Now, the story in Lebanon has taken many twists and turns since my visit there last fall, but it was an extraordinary sight to behold, especially juxtaposed to the way that other regimes, both democratic regimes and autocratic regimes in the region, were responding to similar protest movements. Obviously, in a place like Egypt, the crackdown is comprehensive on political dissent. And in Iraq, a place where we have spent billions of dollars in economic and democracy assistance, their armed forces were training their guns and weapons on the protesters. The Lebanese military having been the beneficiary of long-term US investment, made a different decision. And as we watch our own security services tear gassing peaceful protesters in this country, we recognize that we still have communal work to do on the way in which we protect the right to free speech, both in the United States and in the places in the Middle East where it is allowed today. Listen, the president's budget is stunning, but not surprising. I seem to say that about almost everything that this president proposes in the realm of foreign policy. What we're watching is this attempt to securitize all of our aid to the region. 83% of the president's budget for the Middle East is security aid. 3% of his aid to the region is democracy assistance. And it just misunderstands the ways in which we can effectively protect our interests and our allies' interests in the region. What we have obviously learned over the long run is that the US military is a pretty miserable mechanism to try to enact political change in the region. And now that some of our security partners who just traditionally stockpiled US arms are now actually using them, we have to be much more careful about the way in which we transfer security money into the region. Just a quick rundown of some of the bilateral relationships and how the president's budget affects it that I care most about. Very worried about the deep cuts in assistance to Lebanon, the cuts in economic assistance and in governance assistance, right at a moment where the government, albeit a government still aligned too closely with Hezbollah, are undergoing difficult democracy and economic reforms. This is a moment for the United States to make clear that we are still a democracy and economic partner with the people of Lebanon. Devastating cuts to Tunisia. This is still a model for North Africa and the greater region. They've just formed a new government, and the message being sent that if you make the hard investment in democracy, however imperfect it may be, the United States is going to punish you with draconian cuts, is just, it's so short-sighted. And then sort of pair that together with a budget that contemplates no cuts to Egypt as they continue an absolutely brutal crackdown on dissent, including the murder of an American citizen. I've led the call in Congress to condition at least a portion of our funds on the release of American political prisoners, but of course that just scratches the surface. Yemen is a place that I always care about, and while the United States stepped up at a recent donor conference to put in a significant amount of money, it still pales in comparison to what is necessary in Yemen. And as COVID starts to spread in that country, it's just earth-shaking to think what will happen with no functioning healthcare system if COVID gets worse and worse. There's a second wave in that nation. And what we have to be, I think, very vigilant about in Yemen is not just patting ourselves on the back because we made a $250 million commitment and the Saudis made a bigger commitment. What we now need is follow through in US dollars getting on the ground, and then follow through for our partners. The Saudis and the Emiratis are really good at making commitments, but they're really bad at follow-up. And that's in part because we let them get away with it.
Senator, you've become muted. If you could unmute yourself.
So I worry, as Andrew does, about this proposal for a slush fund in which the administration will have carte blanche to decide how funds are used for Palestinian security. Listen, I, of course, think that the president's policy vis-a-vis Mideast peace has been an absolute disaster. They live in a fictional world in which they believe that they can sort of force march the Palestinians into a negotiation where the starting line is is one in which Israeli interests and only Israeli interests rule. But I think we underestimate the damage that we are doing in real time to the stability of Jordan. And Jordan's obviously got a lot of work to do itself. This slush fund, I think, is not only the wrong way to bring the two sides to the table, but also, I think, very damaging to the Kingdom of Jordan. And then last, we're about to start the U.S. strategic dialogue with Iraq. I have long thought that our aid plan there is upside down. You know, we're putting in about 4 times as much security aid as we are economic and governance aid. And I continue to counsel the administration that they should not have a myopia in Iraq in which they are only looking at it through the Iranian lens. Because even if we were to up our economic and governance commitment, if they don't approve waivers to allow for an energy relationship to continue between Iran and Iraq, there's no amount of US funding that can make up for that. And all that does is empower the hardliners and the Iranian-backed groups inside Iraq. So I came back from a trip last year with Senator Romney to Iraq, believing that we needed to dramatically that we need to essentially flip the way in which money is sent to Iraq between security aid and economic and democracy aid. But I think we have to see the full picture, and our Iran policy is frankly going to cancel out the benefit of additional dollars that may be committed to the new Iraqi government as part of our dialogue that is soon to begin. So I will stop there and look forward to the short time we have for discussion.
Thanks, Senator Murphy. If I could start with a question. So as a senator on the appropriations subcommittee that's responsible for the foreign aid budget, what changes, if any, do you think we're going to see to foreign aid generally, whether it's to this region or other regions in the world, in light of the global pandemic?
Well, so I think that we are going to see a shift in resources into global public health accounts. But because for the next fiscal year, we are already living under a budget agreement, it will be a shift. And that is a potentially dangerous shift, because that money will have to come from Peter in order to pay Paul. So I know Senator Leahy, who chairs that subcommittee, and I've spoken to him at length about this, is contemplating a potential tripling of overall funding for global public health accounts. But that's going to come from somewhere. Now, I can find accounts with which to move it from, but my worry is that it ends up coming from democracy and governance accounts. There's also a lot of interest in standing up some new capacities. So Senator Risch and I don't collaborate on a lot, but we introduced legislation last year establishing a new vehicle by which to send aids to frail developing countries to support their public health infrastructure in the model of the Millennium Challenge program, which was designed to do sort of contract partnerships with nations around economic reform. This would envision a similar contract partnership with nations in which we put American money next to either other donor countries' money or domestic sources of funding in exchange for a timetable of public health infrastructure reform. So it may be that we just end up putting more money into the Global Fund or into Gavi. It also may be that we stand up some new capacities, and we're trying to work through the authorizing legislation and the appropriations strategy right now.
Let me ask you another question regarding, as you identified, Senator, this securitization of U.S. assistance, the 83% of the assistance being requested going to security assistance. And even after, Congress has made what we know will be big changes, it will still be a very, very large percentage, and it has been for a long time. We're having a conversation here in the United States about securitization of our police and, seeing the encroachment of of military thinking and everything as a problem domestically. I'm wondering if you think that will have any effect on the discussion on foreign assistance and whether there would be any more attention or a new look in the Congress at the amount of foreign assistance, for example, to this region that's devoted to security, as opposed to economic and other kinds of assistance.
I think it will, and I've already started to have this conversation, at least on the Democratic side of the aisle. I have long argued about the catastrophe of the over-militarization of American foreign policy, and I'm obviously not alone in making that case. But I think as you look at this public health crisis and you try to decide whether a ratio of 50 or 100 to 1 in terms of spending on conventional military programming and hardware versus international public health is the right balance, you will find very few Americans who would think it's so. Ask Americans whether they are more worried today about a conventional invasion of the United States or another virus shutting down their kids' school and putting them out of work. Of course, they worry more about the latter, and yet we're spending $740 billion in the Department of Defense, and we're spending $12 billion every year in global public health. But to your point, there's also this conversation about the over-securitization of this country, and whether or not you should be spending money on loading up schools with police officers rather than mental health counselors. That, I think, may drive a conversation about how best to spend money overseas. And so I would hope that if there's a new Democratic administration, there will be a more holistic look at how we best protect America overseas and whether the way in which we spend money resources us to win. That may be informed by the domestic conversation that we're having right now.
I'd like to turn to some questions from our audience now. There are a number of questions related to Yemen, a subject you've already raised, Senator. So here are a couple of related questions. There are new arms sales to Saudi Arabia being considered, as well as recent notifications for MRAPs for the UAE. Given Saudi and Emirati actions in Yemen, what do you think the U.S. position should be on providing those weapons? And what do you think the prospects are for U.S. fully extricating itself from the Yemen conflict, particularly should there be a change in the White House come November?
Well, it won't surprise you to discover that I oppose additional arms sales to the Saudis so long as they continue to use our weapons in a civil war that is making the United States less safe. There's just no argument for the United States to continue to be involved in the Yemen civil war, except that the Saudis are asking us. Our relationship with Saudi Arabia should be one in which we partner with them when it is in our interest, and then we let them go it alone when it is not. Query also whether they would have the courage to continue this conflict if they didn't have the moral support of the United States as a defense. When it comes to sales of new PGMs, what we know is that the Saudis consistently are not hitting civilian targets by accident. They're hitting many civilian targets on purpose. The Emiratis have taken U.S. arms and unapologetically and openly transferred them to dangerous extremist groups on the ground like Abu Abbas and the Giants Brigade. And so ask yourself why we would continue to give them money if they continue to believe that it is within their authority and right to take U.S. arms and transfer them to Salafist-aligned militias. There likely is still not the votes in the Senate to reject an arms sale with a veto-proof majority. And a new administration is going to have to take a look at this issue anew. The Obama administration at the end made a number of important changes to the U.S. military relationship with Saudi Arabia, but they did not withdraw from the Yemen war coalition. Many of those that were in high levels in the late Obama era have, I think, changed their view since then. And so to the extent you believe they will populate a Biden administration, that may mean that ultimately a new administration takes a new look at the nature of our security relationship with the Saudis.
Thank you. There is a question also. You mentioned, Senator, that there's less than 3% of this budget request is dedicated to democracy and governance assistance. And so the question is this: it seems that too often democracy and governance are underfunded. What role do you see the Global Fragility Act and Global Fragility Strategy playing in ensuring these areas receive their due?
Well, they are in some ways different conversations. The Global Fragility Act is about how we are able to deploy U.S. resources into fragile and sometimes dangerous places. Listen, we just have to sort of step back and admit that the strategy that we began to employ after World War II, to slowly and methodically build up the number of democracies in the world and the strength of those democracies accrued to the benefit of our country. Democracies don't tend to go to war with each other. Democracies tend to be easier trading partners than autocracies and dictatorships. And so from a security and economic standpoint, we benefit when there are more democratic partners around the world. And we are at a moment where after a sort of long period of time in which we were accumulating democracies, we are now losing them. And there's now this sort of hybrid in which sort of formerly rather traditional democracies have slid into something sort of in between autocracy and participatory democracy. The Global Fragility Act allows us to get into sometimes unsafe spaces to be able to do democratic programming. And I argue that the State Department in a new administration is going to really need some dramatic reforms because, the fact that for much of the Syrian civil war, we had thousands of US troops and almost no State Department diplomats in a country where the underlying problem was a political problem, is a recipe for failure. And so had we been able to get hardened diplomats into parts of Northeast Syria to start doing the work early of figuring out sort of how you could construct a governance system that would empower local Arab and Kurdish populations, but in a way that didn't threaten Turkey, that would have been really worthwhile work. But 18-year-old Marines can't do that. Diplomats can, but we haven't built the security around them in order for them to get into places like Syria. Only the US Armed Forces can. So we need to have a broader conversation outside of the Global Fragility Act of how we create this sort of hybrid diplomat warrior so that we can start doing work in tough places and not just rely on the US military.
Thank you, Senator Murphy. I believe you have to move on to your other commitments now, but I want to thank you so much for being generous with your time and being with us for this discussion. And thanks for all you're doing within the Senate on these issues.
Well, let me just thank the Project on Middle East Democracy for your longstanding partnership with our work. And I think this is a really important moment to highlight the president's budget and its continued lack of commitment to promoting democracy in the region, and look forward to working with you and with your partners in the months to come.
Thanks very much. Okay, we are going to move on now to our panel discussion. Andrew Miller will be coming back to us, and we're also joined by Kori Schake and Nahal Toosi. I know they're all very well known, but just to introduce our panelists very briefly, Kori Schake leads the Foreign and Defense Policy team at the American Enterprise Institute, and Nahal Toosi covers foreign policy and national security for Politico. I'm going to start with a couple of questions to Andrew Miller on the report. So, Andrew, one striking fact in this report, you mentioned it already, is that there are three countries, Israel, Egypt, and Jordan, that continue to command the lion's share of requested assistance. 90%. 90% of all the assistance in this budget request would be for those three countries. So do you think that's the right distribution of U.S. assistance in the region? And if not, what do you think the distribution should look like when we're speaking about by countries in the Middle East, North Africa region?
Thanks, Michelle. I don't think it's the right distribution. The question is, how do we move to a different distribution? And there are two ways to do that. One is to redistribute a fixed pie. The other approach would be to expand the pie so that there's more funding available for foreign aid. And as Senator Murphy was discussing, and given the questions you were asking, there's such an imbalance between defense spending and international affairs spending to the point that it's having very distortive effects on U.S. foreign policy and our ability to achieve our interests. I was doing research recently, and I think between 2001 and 2014, roughly $1.8 trillion was spent in supplemental defense funding for the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia, to include Afghanistan. In that same period, less than $100 billion was spent in the two major foreign assistance accounts. So I think an argument can be made that this should not be viewed as a fixed pie. There are other ways to increase assistance to other actors without necessarily taking it from others. The second point I would make is I think there needs to be more of an emphasis both on countries that are undergoing potentially democratic transitions, whether that be Tunisia or early signs in Lebanon, Algeria, Iraq, where there's an opportunity for more accountable governance, as well as crisis areas like Iraq, like Syria, like Libya, like Yemen. And they're getting short shrift under the president's budgets, and they haven't been getting as much assistance as they should, given what Congress has been appropriating. Also, and this gets back to a point that Senator Murphy was raising about the imbalance between security and non-security assistance. I think one thing that COVID-19 demonstrated is that one of the biggest challenges to the region is not necessarily security. There are security threats, but there are also these other threats that are related to the governance systems, to economic and social inequality, to the mismatch between governments and their societies. And security assistance is not going to help resolve those. In many ways, it's going to exacerbate those problems. So there should be a shifting. And the final point I would just make is I think it makes sense to reevaluate some of the commitments that we have made. And the one thing that I've learned both negotiating the U.S.-Israel MOU on security assistance, working on assistance to Egypt, is that some aspects of assistance made sense at the time they were introduced, but there's a bureaucratic inertia by which they carry through. And these features are often kept not because they still make sense, but simply because it's easier than changing it. And when the Obama administration negotiated an MOU with Israel, we tried to take into account how the relationship has changed, how Israel's security has changed. We tried that a little with Egypt. We didn't go nearly as far as we should have. And you look at a place like Jordan, where U.S. assistance is clearly needed, but they're getting over $700 million a year in direct budgetary support. That may temporarily help to prop up the kingdom, but it's certainly not resolving the underlying problems. And it creates a dependency that's not good for the United States, and it's certainly not good for Jordan. So in a way, President Trump is right that there are problems with foreign aid, but the issue isn't that there's too much of it. It's often that there's not enough and it's not being used in the right ways.
For our audience members, I'll remind you that you can keep submitting your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to ask questions of the panelists, and then we'll turn to your questions. So go ahead and keep writing those in. Andrew, my other question for you is about Tunisia. Why do you think, I mean, this is, it's one of the more, successful cases in the region. And it's a country with a small population. Its needs are relatively modest. But why do you think the Trump administration keeps requesting such drastic aid cuts to Tunisia compared to what the Congress has been appropriating?
I think one of the major reasons is the domestic political angle. Aid to Tunisia does not have much domestic political salience. Trump is not increasing his chances of being reelected or playing to his base by calling for additional aid to Tunisia in the same way that he is for Israel, or in a derivative sense, Egypt and Jordan, because of their peace treaties with Israel. So that's, I think, the major factor for Trump, who tends to view things exclusively through his personal, political, and sometimes other interests. Another reason for it is that it is a relatively small country. It's a country that isn't known to many Americans. I suspect most Americans have heard of Egypt. Most Americans have heard even of Jordan, perhaps, but Tunisia, I don't think they can differentiate it from Algeria or Libya, or maybe Libya because of Benghazi, but or many of the other countries. So there is that. But an underlying reason is what made Tunisia special, and what continues to make Tunisia special, and the reason that there was a major increase in funding for Tunisia during the Obama administration was that there was a recognition that supporting Tunisia's successful democratic transition was profoundly in U.S. interest, that we had a stake in this. And the stake was more than the U.S.-Tunisian bilateral relationship. It potentially had significance for the broader region and U.S. engagement with the Middle East. And those are things that simply don't have currency in the Trump administration. He doesn't seem to be concerned about democracy and governance. He doesn't seem to be concerned about human rights, except when it's taking place within a country that's an adversary, and against which he can score easy political points. So unfortunately, the very things that make Tunisia exceptional, the very things that call for aid to Tunisia, are those elements that are the least appealing, that make the least sense to President Trump.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andrew, and we'll get back to you with some questions from the audience. But right now, I'd like to ask Kori a couple of questions. So, Kori, the president's FY21 request, even though he's requesting a lot less assistance than we know Congress will end up appropriating, still, he proposes more foreign aid for the Middle East and North Africa than for any other region of the world. And so I'm wondering, how you see that. Do you think that makes sense? We're in an era of renewed great power competition. Do you think this continued emphasis in sending more aid to this region than any other makes sense for U.S. interests?
Well, I think it does make sense for U.S. interests because there are opportunities for real change in Tunisia, in Lebanon, in Iraq. Unfortunately, I don't think those are the reasons the president's proposing more aid in the budget, nor does the type of aid he has proposed in the budget or the distribution of it support those reasons. I think Andrew Miller made the argument incredibly well that for the president, this is about support to Israel almost in its entirety. Jordan and Egypt get folded into that, but the increased securitization of aid, the underinvestment in governance issues, and even if you want to make a national security argument, that is, the only thing we care about in the Middle East is the emergence of terrorism that can strike the United States. The best way to do that is to support good governance, because that, more than anything else, is the antidote to the emergence of terrorism. And nothing in the president's proposed spending acknowledges that or supports it.
So, all right, let me ask you to comment on a couple of issues that have already come up. One is, and you've already touched on it, this securitization of aid. This is something you've written about. How effective is that? And then there's the question of the funds for democracy and governance. So, aside from Iran, the Trump administration hasn't shown a lot of interest in engagement on the issue of democracy and human rights in this region. But there are a lot of voices, and we hear them on the left as well as the right, that say that, while democracy promotion might be theoretically nice, the United States isn't very good at it. It doesn't really work, so it's just not worth doing. So, could you comment on those two issues?
Sure. First, on securitization, there are instances where a heavy investment in professionalizing security forces, improving their training and their equipment, and building relationships can be extraordinarily valuable. I think that proved the case across a decade and a half in Lebanon. I think it absolutely also improved the lot of Palestinians when the Bush administration and then the Obama administration invested heavily in Palestinian security forces. It gave Palestinian leaders the ability to police their own space and reduced Israel's involvement in policing Palestine. And I think that not only was good for the people of Palestine and Israel, but it also helped advance the conversation about other issues. So heavy investment in security isn't, by definition, a bad thing, but it appears to be the only piece of this equation that the Trump administration's budget proposal invests in. And that radically skews the conversation. And in many cases, by solely strengthening security forces, you change the domestic balance of power against democratic institutions, against justice and governance, and towards military forces. And this isn't news. We learned this with our assistance to Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. So President Trump is simply repeating that mistake by investing solely in security improvements in the Middle East. Remind me again the second question.
Well, it was just the question of, is the United States any good at democracy promotion, or is it just something that's nice in theory, but we can't actually do?
So I think that's a really important challenge for those of us who are ardent democracy promotion advocates. And I think my answer is we're not nearly as good as we should be. And that's partly because we don't study enough where it's worked and why it's worked. So thank you to Pomed for your huge contribution to all of our understanding about how to advance democracy. We too often invest only in elections rather than ensuring diversity of voices in the political spectrum, rather than investing in ensuring there's freedom of the press and freedom of association, the kinds of things that undergird effective democracy. I also think we're not very good at it because we tend, as the president's budget does, to choose which countries we are going to invest in for reasons that have very little to do with whether the moment of transition is relatively low cost and relatively well advanced. I mean, Tunisia, we ought to be pouring money into helping Tunisians consolidate the brave choices that they have made to advance democracy in their society. Instead, we're not. Instead, we're giving security assistance to Egypt, which is demonstrating no willingness to invest in representative government and restricting the bad decisions, the crackdown on the press, the widespread jailing of democracy activists in Egypt. So it doesn't succeed because we're not looking at the moments in time where investments would be incredibly valuable and could help advance and consolidate.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kori. Just to add an observation from me too, I think that democracy and governance assistance comes and goes a lot. A lot of times the United States isn't engaged for the long run, but we'll pour money into someplace, as you said, around elections or whatever, and then run off and do something else. And so it's very often just not consistent enough over a long time. So thanks. I'd like to ask Nahal a couple of questions now. So Nahal, you've written a lot about this administration's opposition to providing foreign assistance. And so I'd like to have your perspective on, why is it that President Trump keeps putting forward these budgets that are so completely out of line with what we know the Congress will end up appropriating? What do you ascribe the Trump administration's aversion to foreign aid? Is it about the president's personality? Is it about an ideological position? Is it domestic politics? Or how do we understand this? Because it's become a bit of an exercise now that we're going through year after year with these foreign aid budgets.
Well, first of all, thank you guys for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be on a panel with actual experts. I'm usually the one asking the questions, so it's a little bit weird to be on the other side. To answer your question, one thing I've learned in covering the Trump administration, but also just generally speaking, doing reporting is it doesn't have to be one thing or another thing. It's often not a choice. It can be all of these things. In terms of the way that Trump acts in terms of his foreign aid policies and approaches, I would say there are a number of factors. Some of it is his kind of Hobbesian view of the world, a transactional view, thinking, why are we spending this money if we're not getting anything out of it? And his view that the happiness and democracy in another country, he doesn't seem to understand that can, in the long run, help the United States. He wants tangible results immediately, that even material results that could benefit the United States. And when he doesn't see that, one of his questions is, why are we doing this? A second thing I would say is that he and his administration kind of have a sticks-only approach to foreign policy. It's very punishment-driven, very, very much about slapping.
Maximum pressure.
Yeah, on everyone, not just Iran. And one example is recently when Afghanistan, when they were having the political infighting in the government there, Secretary Pompeo went there and then came back and said, we're cutting $1 billion of your aid. And that's kind of, they're like, we're just going to use this as a lever to punish the people that we are upset at, even if they are our allies. I've also, and in this idea of a stick, even in cases where they use it as a carrot, it's about some sort of a tangible political gain or a win that they can point to in this administration. So, and it sometimes backfires. So for Venezuela, for instance, they literally lined up humanitarian aid along the border in a bid to get the people of Venezuela to rise up against Maduro. It didn't work. And over time, I reported this, aid organizations that work in Venezuela or around Venezuela found that people didn't want to take material or goods that had the US label on it. So they had to start disguising the US label, which kind of went against the whole idea of US aid having an effect on our reputation in the first place. And I would also say there's one other factor, which is, you have had people like Mick Mulvaney and others who for a long time have, wanted to cut federal spending, and they don't see international aid as necessarily something that we should be spending our money on. And why do they keep doing it year after year and when the Congress just ignores it? Honestly, some of it could be simply out of spite. This is a president who he just does what he wants. And the more people beg him not to do something, the more he seems determined to do it. I know there are people who've written entire books about this approach. Toddler-like, I believe, is what some of them refer to it as. But I will just say there is this aspect where he just trusts his own view of the world. And the more people tell him it's the opposite, the more he resists. He's a kind of the eternal contrarian.
So, okay, Nahal, you've also raised, other people within the administration. And so I'm wondering why, aside from the Ukraine scandal, career officers at the State Department have been pretty quiet about the Trump administration's repeated efforts to slash foreign aid spending. Is that surprising, or why have people within state and USAID and so forth not spoken up about this?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. First of all, they do, but they do it anonymously to me. So, they don't go out in public, but there are definitely concerns. But I think one reason is that, many of them do view themselves as they are career professionals, they're nonpartisan. To them, it's like, whatever the policy is, my job is to implement it. And I will do that to the best of my ability, as long as I feel like, I'm not violating my oath to the Constitution. So I think there is that professional ethos. And I also think that people know that Congress is not going to put up with this. One of the things I hear over and over again is that if there's one thing that has a lot of bipartisan support on the Hill, even today, it's still foreign aid, humanitarian aid, development aid to some extent, military aid to a large extent. And just, diplomacy. They feel like, and many of them make sure to say, look, especially Republicans, they really care about this. They understand the need for promoting development and democracy and things. So they have a lot of confidence that Congress will just ignore these proposals from the president. So they don't really, see necessarily the point of making a big fuss about it. And I personally believe that that's one reason why Secretary Pompeo and before him, Secretary Tillerson also didn't raise a huge, public stink over it and try to defend their agencies, because I think that, they knew that ultimately it would work out fine, and they didn't see any point in losing political capital with the president by fighting him publicly on it.
Okay, thanks a lot, Nahal. We're going to turn now to questions from the audience, from the participants. So let's see. I'll start with a question to Kori. So, we're returning again to this question of the importance of good governance, and also whether that is related to fighting terrorism effectively. So the question is this, and it's a question from Tom Warwick. If all we provide, this is to you, Kori, if all we provide is military assistance, it's never enough to end a terrorist safe haven. Can Kori address the need for investing and strengthening civilian institutions, such as democratic policing in specific countries in the Middle East?
Oh, I would love to sing chapter and verse from the hymnal on this one. That the over-militarization of American engagement in other countries, first of all, it sends a terrible signal. And second of all, it changes the domestic weight of elements of foreign governments. It increases the bureaucratic and policymaking weight of the security arms in a way that's bad for the development of strong democratic institutions. So we too often, in thinking near term about our security needs, actually create the circumstances for bigger, longer term problems. And to the second part of your question, which is the need to strengthen civilian agencies, the two things that made me despair most about Iraq, the surges in Iraq and Afghanistan, is all we did was surge our military forces. And in both instances, they were supposed to be partnered with big surges of civilian agency involvement. And in neither case were they. So the problem is partly over-militarization of our engagement, but the other part of it is underutilization of all of our many other abilities. And it doesn't even just need to be what the American government can do. A lot of what the American government can do on democracy promotion and on assisting accountable governments in other places is encouraging the engagement of American civil society. I mean, the Gates Foundation has done more for America and the world by strengthening public health infrastructure in many countries in Africa. So the government should do more of it. We should encourage civil society to do more of it, because at the end of the day, strong governance is the best anti-terrorism program. It is also the best American foreign policy that we can and should be advocating and acting on in the world.
Thank you. We have a question. It's a general question, but we can use the example of Tunisia. And I'm going to pose this one to Andrew. So this is a question from Anne Moisan. Improving governance is hard. Fighting corruption and ensuring accountability and transparency is even harder, even in Tunisia. And measuring success is even more difficult. Military and security aid is easier. So, the question is, how far can the United States go to pressure or persuade countries to change and embrace required reforms and shift resources internally, even on their own? So I guess this question is, it's about the practice of US policy, and then also how difficult and maybe unsatisfying it is to try to measure the success of democracy and governance assistance, Andrew.
That's certainly a legitimate point, but in my government career, I often found that the most important things are the most difficult things. And often the easiest things are the least important. So the key becomes finding the place in that Venn diagram where something is both doable and sufficiently important to warrant doing. And that can be very challenging to find those instances. I'm not sure I entirely agree that security aid is easy to measure. I mean, it's easy to measure in a certain sense. You can count how many tanks or planes were provided. You can count how many soldiers were trained. But it's much more difficult to say whether that actually led to an increase in capabilities. And the way that security systems currently operates, at least security systems operated by the State Department in particular, there isn't robust standards for evaluating whether security systems has achieved the objectives for which it's intended. In fact, I wrote a piece recently in Just Security with Dan Mahanti arguing that security systems is a faith-based policy. We say that security aid does all of these things. It increases capability. It promotes American-friendly governments. It gives us access to senior decision makers, which gives us influence over the direction of that country. All of those things make sense at a certain level. They're intuitive, but we don't rigorously evaluate whether they actually come about. I think there clearly can be major strides in evaluating democracy and governance and other forms of support as well. I think there has been, frankly, more of an effort in recent years in that space to begin to do these types of efficacy evaluations, but there's a long way to go, and there need to be strides in that direction. But as things currently stand, security assistance, often isn't thoroughly investigated after the fact. And that's led to the continuation of programs that often don't serve the purpose for which it's intended. I often say facetiously, but one of the primary purposes for providing aid to the Egyptian military in the aftermath of Camp David and the peace treaty was to both secure and support the peace treaty, but also to create a more American-friendly Egyptian government. Arguably, this Soviet-trained and equipped Egyptian military and government was more friendly to the United States. They're the ones who decided to change course. So that's not to say there's no relationship between security aid and the behavior of a foreign government. It just means that it's far more fluid and it's not quite as structural. There are contingent factors that can affect it, and those are the things that we need to study. So of course I agree that it's difficult to measure any types of programs, particularly when there's a political social dynamic, but that doesn't relieve us of the responsibility to look at other programs as well.
Can I reinforce a couple of points Andrew made?
Please,
First,
go ahead.
That just because you can measure something doesn't mean it's meaningful. The Department of Defense excels at coming up with measurable metrics. And as the special inspector for the CIGAR in Afghanistan showed, a lot of the things we're measuring are utterly irrelevant. Also, the ultimate test of our security assistance showed enormous failure in Iraq. The unwillingness of Iraq's security forces to fight ISIS at critical moments, the infusion of Iranian-supported militia in Iraqi security forces. We weren't measuring those kinds of things, and those were the most important elements, it turns out. So we shouldn't let DoD's elegance at identifying numeric metrics take over that space. It's actually really hard to identify progress. And in some of the most important things, it's very slow and it's very 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I also want to reinforce a really good point Nahal made about the administration only using sticks and not carrots, because one important way to advance what the United States wants to have happen is simply political attention, right? It matters. It would matter a lot if the President of the United States showed up in Tunisia to celebrate their progress, or went to Jordan to talk about the difficulty of getting pledge donations delivered for Syrian refugees in Jordan, or to celebrate Jordan's great policies. All of those things, again, they're very hard to measure, but they're enormously significant. And we tend to be able to measure negative influence. We're terrible at measuring positive influence.
Can I say something really quick as well on all this?
Please.
I used to work in Pakistan, and after the 2010 floods, which were really, really terrible, I remember seeing the American ambassador there, Ann Patterson at the time, and there was an event where they were talking about American aid, and actually John Kerry was there too. And the president of Pakistan was there at the time, Asif Ali Zardari, a civilian leader. And, Kerry and Patterson and others were talking about aid to Pakistan to deal with these terrible, terrible floods. And Zardari's response was, well, thanks for the aid, but what we really want is trade. We want your trade. And one of the things that I think that this administration, and probably any U.S. administration, just doesn't do very well is coordinate the trade policy with the aid policy. It's completely different worlds. And that drives people overseas crazy. Like, a lot of them don't want our aid. They would just like to be able to do business with us. And those things seem completely out of whack. Now, I will say Asif Ali Zardari was also known as Mr. 10% in Pakistan because he was alleged to be so corrupt. So maybe he had other motivations for wanting this trade. But, I do think he was making a good point, and it was seems to have been lost on the Americans.
Right. But I mean, trade agreements have become very much a very hot domestic issue and so forth. And so it seems that, using that as part of bilateral relationships has not been so much done recently. Nahal, while I have you, I have another question for you, which is, sort of a big picture question, which is, how do you see the climate for foreign aid? I mean, do you expect Congress to reduce foreign assistance spending as the budget deficit in the U.S. balloons due to coronavirus spending?
I think it really depends a great deal on who wins in November, and I don't just mean the White House. I think if the Democrats retain control of the House, and especially the Senate, I think they're going to continue to increase spending to as much as they want. And I think at that point, we're suddenly going to see a huge concern rise in the Republican Party once again about deficit spending, which they don't seem to be concerned about while they're in power. And so it's this weird thing where I think a lot of it's just going to go down to who's in charge and what people view as the best politics for them. One other thing, along these same lines is that we haven't really talked about is the World Health Organization and how that factors in, and Trump's decision to pull funding from that, and the debate that's going to happen, if Congress can figure out how to prevent that. When you have an institution like the World Health Organization, and in many cases, this is where career officials do talk to me, especially. They're like, look, we work in a lot of countries where the WHO is the only option. And this administration now is trying to withdraw funds from an organization without having a decent alternative in many places. So, I just wanted to throw that in because it hasn't come up yet. But in terms of your original question, I really think it depends on the politics of it and who's in charge.
Great, thanks. Andrew, I have another question for you from the audience. So the question is about the way that security assistance is counted through the budget. The questioner is noting that, and your report notes this, that there are different packages of security assistance, different accounts, and there are DoD accounts, as well as the things that you're mostly talking about in this report that are through the state account. And there are different, they're different, as the questioner says, a different political economy. In other words, through the FMF funds, there are, direct benefits to U.S. arms providers and so forth. Could you talk about this, about the very sort of complicated picture of how the United States does security assistance through these different accounts, and how one can get a sort of more comprehensive picture?
Absolutely. One thing to note, and this is covered in the report, the administration, and not just the Trump administration, past administrations as well, have objectives under which they organize certain types of spending. And the one relevant to this discussion is peace and security. And that does include FMF, foreign military financing, but it also includes IMET, International Military Education and Training. It includes NADIR, non-proliferation, anti-terrorism, demining, and related programs. It includes INCL, International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement. And it even includes some economic support fund when it's primarily aimed at security. So certainly the broader security assistance budget is much larger than FMF. And as you mentioned, Michelle, DoD provides substantial assistance increasingly as well. And they are different, and we should recognize that there are different motivations, there are different implications of different types of programs. And some have fewer side effects than others, but I don't think we should lose sight of the commonalities that do exist. And one of them is that, in particular in the Middle East, which tends to be dominated by authoritarian governments that have close ties to the security establishment, providing security assistance often has the unintended side effect of empowering authoritarian, non-democratic aspiring actors. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have good effects as well. It does in certain instances, but we need to recognize—
Sorry to interrupt you, but are you sure it's unintended?
Not always, not always. I don't think we, I think you would struggle to find a sitting U.S. government official who would acknowledge that, but certainly that may be motivating behind the scenes. But it is true, FMF is larger than these other accounts. FMF, almost every dollar of FMF goes back into the American economy. Some of the other categories does have a benefit domestically, but not to the same scale. And with FMF in particular, there is this domestic political economy in the United States that's critical. There's a reason that defense contractors establish their headquarters or the production facilities in certain districts, because they know they can have the political support. One point I would make about FMF, though, is increasingly I've seen the argument that since the money tends to go back into the U.S. economy, the recipients aren't benefiting from it. And that's not true. I think it's true that they're not benefiting from it as much as they could if it was funding construction and manufacturing in those countries. But it's clearly the case that if Egypt or Israel or Jordan can use U.S. money to add a plane rather than using their own national budget, that is a net benefit to them. Maybe it would be more if they were domestically manufacturing it, but it's not the case that it's exclusively motivated by domestic political interest in the United States, or that it exclusively serves U.S. domestic political interests. That's present, but like with most programs, there are any number of reasons why things are done, and they contribute to the final outcome, which is often overdetermined. Every factor pushes in the same direction. And that's certainly the case with security assistance. But the overall question is certainly a valid one, that we do need to recognize that there are differences, and at the same time that we acknowledge the similarities and do analysis on that basis, we also need to be able to disaggregate them to understand how each program is different, the differential impacts, the differential costs, and that perhaps should lead to a rethinking of that balance. Maybe there's too much FMF. maybe we should be providing more for IMED or for INCL or for Nadir on a relative basis. But the ratios have largely remained constant over the last several years.
I'd like to bring in the other panelists on this question because, I asked Senator Murphy whether he thought in the current domestic climate in the United States there might be a rethinking of the securitization of foreign assistance. But as Andrew's just been discussing, there are reasons why. I mean, the arms industry is a major one for the United States. I think in the recent Stockholm Institute report, U.S. is the largest supplier of weapons to the world. I think more than a third of all the arms sales, and including very much to this region. So the question is, whether we are talking about our primary, subject here is security assistance and the arms sales that go with that assistance. But then, of course, there are also the outright arms sales. Kori, Nahal, do you have any sense that this could possibly change or that the incentives are so strong to keep on selling these weapons and frankly to keep on competing with other world powers, notably our allies in Europe, to sell weapons that do you foresee any possibility of change here?
Kori, you go first.
Okay, Nahal. I think the pandemic is going to create sustained downward pressure on defense spending in the US. And so that is likely to increase the desire by defense contractors and the big defense production companies for more foreign sales. But I think that's going to get overwhelmed by the fact that our definition of national security is going to be pushed outward and more inclusive by the pandemic. We're going to be more interested in the public health infrastructures in other societies. And that, I think, has the potential to rebalance some of this foreign assistance. I also think Congress, which has always been activist about the human rights and political consequences of foreign aid, has gotten even more so as the Trump administration has made it so central in our foreign trade and foreign assistance. I mean, it's a mystery to me why we aren't more worried about American farmers and putting them at the forefront of American assistance programs. But the Trump administration has not done that. And Congress, the strength of the congressional move, for example, against continued arms sales to Saudi Arabia because of the war in Yemen, really did constrain the administration. And I think that's likely to pick up speed as we look at developing countries struggling with the public health consequences of the pandemic. And that's just beginning.
Thanks. Nahal?
I am just going to be the cynic here. I'm starting to feel like people are accepting the pandemic and the deaths that are coming from it. And it's just kind of becoming like gun deaths in the United States. In the beginning, I talked to folks and I mean, there was a sense that, yeah, this could change everything, like we'll refocus our national security. And I don't know, over time, I don't know how it's going to defeat the huge interests and the huge lobby that like the defense industry and others have. If anything, you're seeing just, the borders get stronger, the tensions rise among countries. I mean, I think there's a strong possibility that, people will just become more isolated and more inward and that will lead to them wanting better defenses. So I don't know, we can maybe meet back here in a couple of years and see who is.
Well, Pomed's going to keep producing this report every year, I think. So we'll have more opportunities to discuss this. I want to raise a different subject. We have a participant watching from Germany who has a question. So the question is about U.S.-European cooperation in democracy and governance support. And, how might it evolve? Clearly, we see a lot of European skepticism of President Trump's foreign policy. And they've been focusing in Europe on what they call a strategy of resilience, of building resilience in the Middle East, as opposed to building democracy and governance, kind of going off in their own direction on this. I'm curious whether the panelists have any comments on European engagement in the region and what the prospects might be for the United States and Europe to be working together on these issues.
I'll take a swing at that one. The first thing we Americans should remember is that just because others have different approaches than we do, doesn't make us right, and that doesn't make them wrong. And European investments in strengthening resilience, I think, make it easier for governments that are not democratic and that fear the intrusiveness of American demands. Focusing on resilience can actually make it easier to partner with countries and to find common purposes. The second thing is, I notice, and Michele, I'd be interested in your view on this because you're such an expert on the region, but my sense is that in talking to folks in the Middle East, if you start by talking about the rule of law rather than the advancement of democracy, they are more receptive to what it is we want to create in our programs about expanding democracy. But I'd be interested, Michele, do you have that experience or not?
Well, look, I think, first of all, it varies a lot from country to country, right? And it also, I mean, obviously the climate in a place like Tunisia and the receptivity is very different from that in other countries. And so, and then look, as far as rule of law goes, it's incredibly important. But the problem is that authoritarian systems generally do not want rule of law, right? Because they're often buttressed by corruption and patronage and so forth. And so, unfortunately, the idea that you could somehow build the rule of law infrastructure, so to speak, for a future democratic system, like, it would be great if you could do that, but it's very difficult to do it without political contestation, and so forth. So I think it depends, but there are clearly, if you look at the situation in Morocco, it's going to be very different from what it is in Egypt, where, which kind of sectors where there are some openings, whether from the society, whether there's interest from civil society, whether even, within the ruling elite, there are openings to certain kinds of changes. So it really depends. Yeah.
And Michele, I would just add that, Europe certainly isn't a monolith, and there are important differences in foreign policy outlook generally, but in particular towards the Middle East. And, from my experience in government, very different working from some Southern Europeans on Middle East questions than working with the Nordic countries. And that doesn't mean that either position is illegitimate, but it illustrates that there are divides. And in the past, the United States often played a critical role in reaching a consensus within Europe to get them engaged. Germany has tried to do that as well, and they're trying to find a middle position. But in the absence of U.S. involvement, those centrifugal tendencies can get stronger. That may change because Europeans are beginning to recalculate, can we rely on the United States? Do we need to take ownership of our own future in a very different way than we have before? But if you see something closer to what existed prior to the Trump administration, I think that the consensus position within Europe, to the extent there is one, will be influenced by the position the U.S. adopts. And obviously, the Trump administration, which has this bizarre aversion to Europe, in particular, the more democratic parts of Europe, have forfeited that role, have really been out to lunch.
Okay, we're down to our last few minutes. I do have one last question from the audience I want to bring up. I'll put that question out there, and then I'll just give each of the three of you a chance for a very short either response to the question or any other concluding thought you want to add. So the questioner, Nicole Robinson, asked, there's been a recent shift from the Trump administration to focus on economic aid as a tool to encourage empowerment through in different countries with initiatives like the WGDP Act. How do you see economic aid playing a role in change at the government level? How do you make sure that aid is effective in countries that are saturated with foreign aid? And, the questioner didn't raise this case, but of course, there is the case of Palestine and some, economic aid initiatives. In fact, an attempt by the Trump administration to focus strongly on potential economic aid to the West Bank and Gaza, as a way to entice Palestinians to participate in the Trump peace plan and so forth. So again, let me just leave it out here for anyone who'd like to respond to that question and or any final thoughts before we conclude.
I'll go.
Thanks, Nahal.
Like I said, I was saying earlier, I don't think that the trade/economic aid stuff is very well coordinated with the humanitarian development, other types of aid. I just, even in this administration, but you're right, from the very start, this administration has talked about promoting prosperity. They do make this a bigger aspect of what they try to promote. I will say that I don't think that when people want that, though, that they want that at the expense of other values. So the Palestinians, they have felt very insulted by a lot of all this because they feel like the administration is basically telling them, forget your political rights, give up your dreams of statehood, just go make money. And that, sure, they want to be wealthy like everybody else, but they're not going to give up their political dreams and desires just because this administration or any administration tells them to. They feel like it's a bribe or something, and it's insulting to them. So I just, so it's one of those things where like there are some positive possibilities that could come from this focus on prosperity, but if you divorce it from other issues like democracy, human rights, it's just not going to have quite the effect that you want. And one other thing I just wanted to raise as a final point is, the US has often set the example for democracy, for human rights. We try to be a model for the world, and I should add, for accountability and trying to root out corruption. And increasingly, because of developments in this administration and questions about everything from whether, for example, the president is going to step down if he loses or not this November, I think that the role model, the example idea is very much fading in the eyes of much of the world. When they see that Ivanka Trump gets all her trademarks in China and all these other things are happening that suggest corruption here, then they're not going to listen to us lecture them on things like that. So these are very much real issues, and people follow news about the U.S. They do, and they know what's going on, and so that's very important to keep in mind.
Great point, Nahal. Thanks very much. Kori, do you have any final thoughts?
I do. So on the question about economic assistance, first, I would encourage the questioner to go to the work of my AEI colleague, Karen Young, who does a lot of interesting research and has a financial tracker that will allow you to go country by country and see where they get economic development assistance and whether there are political ties to it. It's extraordinarily good work. And Michele, on your very good question about the efforts by the administration to tie economic assistance and political developments in Palestine, I despair because it's basically Chinese policy. right? To say, we're going to help make you prosperous, so you shouldn't care about essential political liberties. And that is fundamentally un-American. It shouldn't be American foreign policy. We ought not to tie those two things together.
Thanks, Kori. Andrew, last word to you.
Michele, thank you for moderating this panel on behalf of Pomed. As usual, you did a fantastic job. And also thank you to Kori and Nahal for agreeing to participate, and to Senator Murphy, who obviously had to move on. I do think we're at an inflection point in this country, and no one knows what's going to happen. It could lead to substantial change. It could lead to regression. It could lead to muddling through in one way or another. And U.S. aid to the Middle East and North Africa, or to the broader world, may seem to be a small part of it, but the American example matters, and American practices matter. And I think, unfortunately, the Trump administration has, as Kori just said, is adopting the methods and tactics of some of our adversaries, and is undercutting what has made the U.S. somewhat unique. Not exceptional in the exceptional term, but to a greater extent than other countries for accounting for these issues. And we're beginning to see now, in the fourth year of the Trump administration, the costs of the United States abdicating its leadership role. And it's just not felt internationally. It's also felt by the American people. And I hope that in understanding the connections between what the U.S. is doing abroad and how Americans at home are affected by that, more Americans will be interested in what's happening. They'll begin to speak out. They'll begin to follow this, because it may be convenient to lead one's lives and try to ignore these broader issues, but if you're not paying attention, it's still going to affect you. So, I hope this report is a small contribution in that vein. And again, thank you all for attending and hopefully reading our long report that we spent several months putting together.
Thanks very much, Andrew Miller, Nahal Toosi, Kori Schake. Thank you all for being with us. Thanks to all the participants for joining us, and congratulations to Pomed on a great report. Bye-bye, everybody.